Good morning, this is Nigel Farage with Phone Farage on LBC. It's 9 o'clock and I'm here for the next 30 minutes taking your calls. This is your chance to put any question you want to me and I'll do my very best to answer. So the number for you to get in touch is 0345 6060 973, and don't forget you can also watch Phone Farage on the website lbc.co.uk. And we go straight to our first caller, who is Lucy in Ashtead. Good morning.
Good morning. Hello, Miss Farage.
Yes, Lucy, hi.
Hi, I'm a nurse and I've worked with nurses from all over the world. I'd like to ask your opinion on how you feel about the language test for nurses and what impact this will have on nursing as a whole. I'm not sure whether nurses should be formally academically tested on their language or it should be passed on an interview and their skills and caring nature be a stronger assessment of their ability as a nurse.
Well, one of the abilities of a nurse, of course, is to actually communicate with the patient as to what's going on, what they can expect, roughly what type of doctor might be coming round. And so speaking the English language, it strikes me, Lucy, as being pretty important. One of the arguments that I get is, well, of course we have nurses and doctors that don't speak particularly good English, because without all these foreign nurses and foreign doctors coming into the country, we couldn't run the National Health Service. But I think, my view, it's an absolute disgrace that we turn people away from nursing courses because there isn't enough space and then have to rely on overseas labour. That's not to say, I'm sure you've worked with some wonderful nurses and doctors that have come from all over the world, but my view, they need to speak English and we should be training more of our own people. What do you think?
I agree we should be increasing the number of homegrown nurses.
Yeah.
But I also think we risk missing out on a lot of very skillful, caring people by formalising the test. I think most nurses have a very good standard of English when they come. The formal tests are really quite rigorous, and is that the type of academic nursing we need?
I get what you're saying. What you're saying actually effectively is that to become a nurse you need to sort of pass a degree-style test, which perhaps isn't very relevant. Is that really the point?
No, I believe you do need to pass a degree-style test.
Okay.
But so have most of these nurses from coming in. The training in other countries is potentially far more rigorous than it is in England.
Yeah.
And so they are of an academic level. As to how much they need to speak of English, English is a very complex language, and I think to communicate to a patient, yes, you need that, but you also need a lot of other skills.
Yeah,
and
okay.
I've seen such a difficulty in language used on a day-to-day basis on the ward to warrant full academic testing to such a degree.
Okay, no, Lucy, it's a point very well made. Just one last thing I would say is that when we talk about the benefits of foreign nurses and doctors coming into Britain, one of the things we forget is that in many cases they're coming from countries that need good nurses and good doctors even more than we do. And there's some evidence that African countries are losing some of their best medical professionals who are coming to our country. So I do think we should train more of our own. But
Thanks for the call. While we're on the subject of language tests, Mr. Farage, the week began with the Prime Minister, as part of his dream of a one nation, suggesting that more should be done to ensure that Muslim women learn to speak English, and also talking about the idea that if they don't, he thinks perhaps in some instances they're being held back by fathers, husbands, whatever, they might even look possibly at deporting them from the country. Whether that's ever practical, of course, is another matter. I mean, what did you make of his view?
He says these things occasionally, just to sort of cheer up the electorate, and then nothing gets done and we forget about it for 6 months. We see this again and again and again. I mean, gradually, the Prime Minister's narrative on this has changed, and it has shifted over time, which reflects, of course, where public opinion is going on the issue. But do I actually genuinely think he's going to lift a finger to do anything about it? When yesterday in Davos, he made it absolutely clear that he will continue after the renegotiation and after he hopes he wins the referendum to support the free movement of people. One does not equate with the other. The one argument he was making at the start of the week is we have to control immigration and then integrate those that we've got into society, which I completely agree with if he meant it. But then on the Thursday he gives a speech where actually the effect of what he's going to do is the opposite.
And lastly, one thing he could do, I don't know about your local authority, but mine sends me all sorts of information about recycling in an absolute plethora of languages, all sorts of languages, the same when you go to an NHS hospital or anything else. If he's that determined. Why doesn't he just stop that? Why don't we just have signs and literature in English? If I lived in France, I don't expect to...
Yeah, well, let alone the interpretation costs that the police force have to go through, that the National Health Service have to go through. I've been saying this for years, Nick, and taken a shed loads of abuse over it, but I do basically think that if anyone comes to this country, they do need to speak the language. Otherwise, what chance have we got of all living together in one community and one society?
Let's move on, Mr. Farage. Where do we go?
We go to Nick in Newmarket. Good morning.
Good morning to you both.
Hello.
First time I've spoken to you, so thanks for allowing me on. I just wanted to get your thoughts, really. Very, very quick questions. On the release of the report into Alexander Litvinenko's murder yesterday, do you think it was wise to point the finger at Vladimir Putin? Do you think that could wreck any potential alliance in Syria? And what do you think Cameron's response should be?
Well, lots of questions there. I mean, the first thing to say is that the European Union will decide in foreign policy terms what we do with Russia. You know, it's very interesting that increasingly it's not a British Foreign Secretary that we see attending global summits. It is Mrs. Mogherini, who is the Foreign Affairs Minister for the European Union. The EU hate Putin, absolutely despise and loathe Putin, and this battle between Putin and the EU, the sort of fulcrum point of it is the Ukraine. All right. So the European Union wants to expand to the east, is signed up to an association treaty with the Ukraine, wants to have visa-free access for Ukrainians into the European Union, and ultimately wants the Ukraine to become a full member of the European Union. And the Russians see that as a threat. And that's led to a serious deterioration of relations. I suspect that even if Putin wasn't in charge of Russia, any Russian leader would have been worried by the EU's expansion to the east. However, when it comes to Litvinenko, look, when Nick hosted a debate in 2014 between Clegg and I, Clegg kept trying to say Farage is pro-Putin. I'm not pro-Putin. I'm just pro the sensitivities of Russia about this eastward expansion. What do I think of the report? Look, it's pretty clear, isn't it, that we've had thuggery and murders on London streets and country houses in Surrey, and all sorts of extraordinary things have happened. And the sheer number of people who have been critical of Mr. Putin, journalists, indeed former business partners with whom he's fallen out with. There was an estimate David Davis made to the House of Commons yesterday that something like 100 people have been murdered in strange circumstances. So do I approve of the Litvinenko report? Yeah, I do, actually. I think it's really frank and really honest. And do I think that in diplomatic terms we should try to get some of the Russian spies out of London? Actually, yes, I do. Because, whilst I don't want to go to war with Mr. Putin, I think our priority should be to make London streets safe and not to have Russian-style gangland warfare. What do you think, Nick?
I think it's bound to put Putin's nose out of joint, and I'm glad that. Well, I think Cameron's going to earn his crust in the next kind of steps he takes.
Well, we'll have to see, and certainly when it comes to Syria, and perhaps even the bigger debate about global jihadism, what I've always said on that is, whilst I dislike many of the things that Putin does, on that greater, bigger battle, actually, we're on the same side.
Thank you, Nick. Where do we go now, Mr. Farage?
We go to Sandra in Maida Vale. Good morning, Sandra.
Good morning to both of you. I would just like to say, now that the BBC has this leaked document and they are accepting responsibility for all the poor victims that Jimmy Savile was abused, don't you think it's time that they gave them an apology and gave them compensation?
Yes. And yes. Well, I can't really fight you, Sandra. I can't really argue with you. I mean, I don't know as much about the media culture as Nick Ferrari knows about the media culture that perhaps existed at the BBC a few years ago, but it does seem beyond belief that just no one blew the whistle. But it wasn't just this guy, was it? It wasn't just Savile, because we had the Stuart Hall stuff that was happening in the north of England. And I think, Rolf Harris in and out of studios and all sorts of things happening. So clearly there was an absolutely appalling culture at the BBC. But I tell you, Sandra, I tell you where this is difficult, where this is really, really hard, is that the three people I've just mentioned, accusations were made against them and they were found to be guilty. and in Harrison Hall's case, in a court of law, and they're serving prison sentences. The difficulty comes when somebody, actually coincidentally called Nick, says that a former field marshal, a former prime minister, and several other people very influential in British society abused him 30 years ago, and on the basis of no evidence whatsoever, just one person say so, we see people's names being dragged through the mud. We saw Leon Britton, or Lord Britton, who'd been a former European commissioner, a former British cabinet minister, and we now see Field Marshal Bramall, who I think is our highest decorated living soldier at 92. Their names being dragged through the mud. And my criticism is, how on earth, on the evidence of one individual, can you put public figures through something like this? And even worse, Sandra, and look, I'm on Bernard Hogan-Howe's side. I want the Met to be good and effective, but not to apologise to people. Which, and in the case of Lord Britton, months before he died, they knew they weren't going to press charges. And I just think that the Metropolitan Police need to think about this very carefully. This whole issue, Sandra, of historic abuse, it is very, very difficult. I'm not saying the police have got an easy job, but we have to be very, very careful when we go after public figures that we do not do so on the evidence of just one individual.
But surely when you get it wrong, you have to apologise. It's human nature, isn't it?
And that hasn't happened, and that's just plain wrong.
Quick response from you, Sandra. What do you think the BBC needs to do now, by the way?
Well, it was very obvious there was more than one person speaking out, and I think that now they need to own up and accept responsibility and say that we're really, really sorry, we got this wrong. And as far as Jimmy Savile was concerned, he just thought he was God and he could do whatever he wanted to, and no one was prepared to argue with him. And
I've got a note here that you actually met him on one occasion, Sandra. Is that right? I trust, I'm very sorry to couch my language carefully, I trust you're not one of his victims, are you?
No, for the grace of God go I. No, not at all. I met him at the Marriott Hotel. We used to do, every year there was a dinner for the children with special needs. He'd come along, it was a fundraiser, and I was the youngest waitress there. I was working with my mum, and he just made a beeline for me, absolutely dived, come straight over. He put his arm around on my shoulder, and I just said, I'm very sorry, Mr. Savile, I have to go back to the kitchen to collect something. The man, you could see he was just a pervert.
Ugh, ghastly. You had a lucky escape.
Sandra was very wise not to be starstruck, wasn't she?
Yeah, and that was the problem, I think, in many instances. You're a very smart woman, Sandra. Thank you. We have to move on, though. Regards to your mum. Thank you.
We do. And the next caller is going to be Joe in the delightful market town of Barnstaple. Joe, hello.
Hello, Nigel. Hello, Nick.
Hello, sir.
I was just curious, really, as there's been a lot of debate over whether we should ban Donald Trump. Where do you stand on the issue, considering he could be the next president of the United States? And lastly, also, if you were an American voter right now, out of all the candidates, who would you support?
That's a really tough one. Oh, you've really got me there, Joe. But I've got I can play for time with the first answer.
Old trick.
Look, I don't believe in. I mean, frankly, I'm not for banning things. Full stop. Unless you absolutely have to. I believe in free speech. And I think the fact that hundreds of thousands of people signed up to a website to ban this guy from coming to this country is just plain wrong. And let me give you a modern example of why this banning idea, when it comes to people's voices and ideas, is crackers. Do you remember Nick Griffin won a seat in the European Parliament for the northwest of England? And Question Time, quite rightly, said, as the BNP now have, it was 2 elected representatives in the European Parliament, they have to appear on the show. Quite right, absolutely. That's the BBC's job, is to make sure that from across the spectrum of votes,
a wide variety of voices,
those views get represented.
Yep. Do
you remember the furore? People like Peter Hain appearing on the television saying, if he goes on this programme, he'll sweep the country. And all this nonsense. And actually, those of us that were saying, no, put Mr. Griffin on, you'll see how blooming awful he is. And you see, frankly, he hasn't got any good ideas at all. And he went on. He was a complete and utter disaster.
It's the end of the party, isn't it?
And you can trace the decline and actually destruction of the BNP to that very moment. So, Joe, I do not support banning people like Mr. Trump or Geert Wilders or whoever it is. But it's even worse than that. We've now got universities banning speakers from coming to universities. I mean, Jermaine Greer banned from going to Bristol University, demands for a statue of Cecil Rhodes to be torn down at Oxford. And I'm really worried, Joe, that within our universities there is a new mentality of banning things, of shutting out free speech, when the whole point about a university education is it should be about being exposed to everything and making your mind up. Now, the second question...
Yes, you bought some time there, Mr. Farage.
I bought lots, didn't I? Joe, I just don't know. I could not vote for Hillary Clinton. I think her sense of entitlement towards the job is just too ghastly. And actually, when you look back at Whitewatergate and some of the financial scandals that happened back in the 1990s, there are no circumstances in which I could vote for Hillary. So I would like to vote for a Republican, and a sensible Republican who says that if Britain leaves the European Union, our trade relations with America can get even closer. And Bush is saying that, and Cruz is saying that, and I suspect Trump will probably say that as well. I haven't yet made my mind up, Joe. There we are. Who would you support, Joe, if you were an American?
Well, to be honest, it's quite difficult, really. The mess that's over there. But,
it is.
Donald Trump strikes me as not being presidential material. So, if out of that option, I would have to go with Ted Cruz or Rand Paul.
All right.
I mean, Rand Paul, I know, and I've met Rand Paul. I know his father. I like Rand very, very much, and I was hoping that he'd make a bigger play for the presidency. And if he was one of the front runners, I would undoubtedly back him. But we do have to say one thing: that whilst Trump's style may be a bit rich for our blood on this side of the Atlantic, he has touched on some issues where Americans have felt completely unrepresented, frankly, by virtually everybody on Capitol Hill.
Thanks for that. Let's go to some of the emails, tweets, and this is a text question from Wendy in West Wickham. I read in The Sun this week that Europe wants to tear up the Dublin Convention and then allow the number of migrants settled on each country to be allowed through economic output. What would that mean for Britain? Please ask Nigel Farage. Is that correct? This
yes.
is broadly speaking the new plan that might come in March, as I recall. Is that right?
Well, the Dublin Convention basically was a kind of a modern update of the original Geneva Convention, and what it meant was that you should claim refugee status in the first safe country that you come to.
Which is widely abused, Mr. Farage.
Which has been widely abused for years, and of course overwhelmed by what's happened over the course of the last year with a number of migrants arriving through the Mediterranean and through the Balkans. So what they've decided to do, because, and by the way, Chancellor Merkel wanted the Dublin Convention to go, and the one thing you must understand about the modern-day European Union is pretty much what Mrs. Merkel wants is what Mrs. Merkel gets. So they're scrapping it, and that means that for Greece and Italy, who've had an almost impossible number of people to deal with, they will be shoveling them to Germany now as quickly as they possibly can. What it means for us is that people who had been registered in, say somebody from Syria had been registered in Greece and had then turned up at Dover and said, let me in, we could say, no. If you're claiming refugee status, you go back to Greece, old son, because that's
where you arrived.
If that is scrapped, then frankly we can't really send them back anywhere. So I think the pressure on people in Calais to jump on the back of lorries and by some means get to Dover, thinking there's no chance of them being sent back, is bigger.
But when you look at the figures this week from George Osborne, which you must celebrate the fact that there are an increased number of jobs, that employment is going up. If I'm a Syrian and I've arrived in Greece, I want to get to Britain. This is the land of milk and honey, isn't it? Of
course, everybody does. But, as we know, net migration last year, if you believe the official figures, was 336,000. By the way, I don't believe the figures. I think it's considerably higher than that. And you can tell that looking at the number of national insurance numbers that were issued. The point is, we know that excessive immigration has driven down wages, put intolerable pressure on the health service, the education system, you name it. And I want us to have controlled immigration. We've had that. The other thing we've had is a judgment this week that some Syrians who were in the jungle at Calais are now welcomed into Britain. In fact, they arrived last night. They arrived at St Pancras last night.
This is their human rights to be with their
human
brothers,
rights,
I think, or certainly their family.
Because they already have family in this country. So whichever way you look at it, for a Prime Minister who promised that he would bring immigration down to tens of thousands, it has not been a very good week.
What will he get out of Davos?
3/5 of 5/8 of very little. Other than his big corporate mates saying, we're going to back you, Prime Minister. And already this week, Goldman Sachs have announced a big donation to the Keep Britain in the EU campaign. JP Morgan have decided they're going to put a big lump of money into keeping us part of the European Union.
It's worth saying the IMF have talked about a tidal wave. Their words, a tidal wave of refugees, which is unsustainable in certain areas of European life.
Yes, they have, and they're absolutely right. But despite all of that, rather than addressing the problems, what Mr. Cameron is doing is he's with his big mates in Davos who are shoveling money. They'll shove millions into his campaign to keep us in the European Union. And what you've got here is the unholy alliance of the big banks and big politics, those very same big banks, by the way, that behaved appallingly, and the listeners to this show had to bail out back in 2008, and they're going to tell us what we should do in the future. My advice is we should ignore them.
Well, let's go back to the callers.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to Keith in Worcester. Keith, good morning.
Good morning. Hello.
Yeah.
Nigel, you got an awful lot of stick when you recognised that Putin had a lot of support within his country and was doing a job for his country. But now we're saying that he shouldn't have approved the assassination of Litvinenko. And can I first say that was a terrible murder. It shouldn't happen. We should get justice there. But we do exactly the same thing. In fact, our Parliament does exactly the same thing, in that it approved assassination in a foreign country of British nationals, who we now think are traitors. And I specifically say Mwazi, Jihadi John, or the two people that were killed on Christmas Day by our drones.
Keith, you make an absolutely excellent point. You're quite right. That you're absolutely right. Our government and Parliament do approve of us killing people via drones who are, fighting with jihadis in the Middle East or North Africa. You make a very good point. However, when we talk about Russian, shootings or killings or beatings, we're not just talking about Litvinenko, who I suppose he could argue was a security risk. We're talking about wealthy businessmen who die in strange circumstances in mansions in Surrey. We're talking about people sort of going into their flat in the Docklands in the world of business. So I think your basic point is right, and we shouldn't be deeply hypocritical, and we shouldn't be holier than thou. But I think the scale of what is happening with Russia and the scale of the number of people that are going missing rather dwarfs what we're doing.
Thank you for that. Just before we go to the next caller, Roy, you're going to be up next. It was this week, I believe, Mr. Farage, that Austria has declared that they will only have a certain number of asylum seekers and migrants. I think from memory it was 37,500, but don't quote me. And after that, that's it. The doors are bolted. This, of course, is in total opposition to EU policy. If Austria can get away with it, won't other countries try?
Well, they will. And actually, if you go a little bit further east than Austria, you come to countries like the Czech Republic and Hungary and Slovakia, who are saying to the European Union, if you think you're going to impose your quotas on us, you've got another thing coming. And that's why the French Prime Minister, Valls, yesterday said that this migration crisis could actually completely end Schengen, and in many ways, the European project. I mean, things are serious.
On the march? Does anybody have a number around the world of how many people are on the march currently?
What I can tell you is this, that the traditional means by which you decided who was a refugee or who wasn't were an individual or groups of individuals who feared persecution because of their religion or their convictions. And what the European Union, in their infinite wisdom, have done is to broaden the definition of who can apply to be a refugee to people who are from war-torn parts of the world. The last UNHCR report I saw on this said there are currently 59 million people who are displaced by war somewhere around the world. So presumably, Mr. Juncker, and if you're listening too, do please call in.
Yes, indeed. We'll put you to the top of the queue.
Presumably, Mr. Juncker, that means 59 million people can come to you. I mean, whatever our sympathy for people who are displaced by war and gone through the most appalling time, in that Syrian conflict, frankly, there is a limit to the number of people that Europe can accept. And I'm not sure how this is all going to end. Badly, I suspect. And I say that because the number of people that have arrived in Greece so far this month is nearly 20 times bigger than the number of people who arrived nearly 20 times the number that arrived in January last year. So goodness only knows where we're going once the summer comes. And I suspect that's why Cameron wants to get this referendum out of the way as quickly as possible.
But if Alan Johnson were in the studio, who's the Labour leader of the Stay In campaign, he would say, but this makes it all more important to stay in Europe because we have our borders at Calais rather than having our borders at Dover, so we can defend the line, if you will, because we're still in Europe. If we came out, we'd have to pull up the border controls in Calais and put them back into Dover.
Well, maybe before the Dublin Convention was about to be abolished, he might have had an argument, but that argument, Alan, has weakened this week considerably. And just think about this. If the British people vote to stay in the European Union, our chances of negotiating opt-outs in the future will be very, very limited indeed, and I suspect the migrant quota will ultimately be applied to us.
This is the Daniel Hannan position, isn't it? Imagine what they do to us then.
Absolutely.
Because they're bad enough now.
Absolutely. You know, if we are humbled and humiliated in their eyes by saying, yeah, OK, guys, you can go on making our laws, you can go on making our decisions, then I think things will get very much worse. And the idea that because we have a border check at Calais and not at Dover, we're better off is nonsense. What we need are proper border checks at Dover to decide who can and can't come into this country. It's not hard. There are 200 countries around the world that do this. You can't just breeze in anywhere unless you can show that you've got a passport, an address to go to. I mean, you know, all of that, or a visa if some countries require that. And all I'm asking for us to do is to become like 200 other countries in the world. Normal countries control their borders, and make sure that not too many of the wrong people are coming in.
Let's go back to the calls. Where are we going?
We're going to Roy in Brookman's Park. Good morning, Roy.
Right. Yes, good morning, Mr. Farage. I watched Question Time last night, and they took a vote, and it was 2-1 to stay in. Now, I remember fighting very hard and being assaulted at Conway Hall for fighting to not to enter the European market. And then, if you recall, the budget was 14 times more for the in vote than it was for the out. And my concern is that the public will still have to listen to the myths and the lies, and if we vote to stay in, it's just going to be Armageddon, and white people can't see it.
Are you expressing concerns? Because it's worth noting that Nigel Farage, I think, might hold the record for the most appearances on Question Time. If not, he's damn close to it. Roy, do you think the audience is slanted then? Is rigged, I should say?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I mean, last week it was a doctors' debate, and guess what? Half the audience was doctors. Of course it's rigged.
Nigel Farage chuckling there. You have been on a number of times, and also you've had a few incidents during your career at Question Time.
I've been on 29 times. It's remarkable. I mean, they keep having me. Whenever I turn up, Dimbleby says, "Oh, not you again." Look, it's. Let's be honest. It is still a good programme. You know, I mean, I do agree with Roy that at times the BBC have problems with their audiences, but you know, I've had some Question Time audiences that I found really, really difficult. Equally, I've had some Question Time audiences that have been very much on my side with what I've had to say. So it kind of cuts both ways.
Do you think Britain is 2-1 in favour of staying in at the moment? No. I work to this 33-33-33. Do you? I.e., there's about...
a third love it.
Yep.
A third hate it.
Yep.
And a third...
just don't know yet.
A third are sceptical.
Okay.
A third are sceptical. They want border controls. They want to make sure we can continue to sell our goods into European markets. But that third in the middle are much more persuadable, I think, to vote for out than for in. And look, the opinion polls, Roy, at the moment are 50-50. There was a poll in the Mail on Sunday last week that showed the outside with a 6-point lead. That, I suspect, was a reaction to Cologne. But I think a lot of women are saying, goodness gracious me, if we vote to stay in, is this what's coming to this country? So Roy,
is it what's coming to this country?
Yes, of course it is. I mean, those 1,000 young men that were outside a train station in Cologne will, within 3 to 4 years, have German passports.
Which means they effectively can come here.
Which means effectively that they can come here. And there is a problem with this. You know, maybe Mr. Cameron's speech at the beginning of the week was right, that if we control things and integrate people, we're not going to have these problems. But if vast numbers of people who speak a different language turn up in our towns and cities, we are going to have huge social problems. So, Roy, don't worry about the audience last night. It's 50-50 out there. There's everything to play for. And all we have to do, and that you weren't able to do, back in 1975, is to make people understand that the number of German cars that are driving on London's roads this morning, and the amount of French wine that, well, I had some of it yesterday, actually, that gets sold into our country.
I would never have known.
That actually they need us more than we need them. And whether we're in a political union or outside a political union, we will go on buying goods and services and widgets and motor cars and bottles of wine from each other. And once people, Roy, have that reassurance, I think they will vote for us to take back control of our own lives. I hope so.
Time for one more, if we're
Time for one more. We're going to Paul in Brecon. Good morning.
Good morning. Nigel, I resigned from UKIP along with many others here in Brecon and Radnor because of the institutional bullying within UKIP Wales. So bad is the institutional bullying still today within UKIP Wales, Nigel, that I've had a UKIP parliamentary candidate phoning me up at night, a woman, scared stiff, in case officials started to come round to her house. That's how bad it is.
Really?
UKIP Wales. And let me tell you, anyone who wants to check on this can go to just Google UKIP and Brecon. They'll find a site, and on that site...
it sounds I mean, I have to say, Paul, you may be right. I don't think you are. But it all sounds, I think, to most LBC listeners, a bit marginal. And I know that people join parties and get upset with parties and leave parties. But let me just say this to you, that if I thought there was bullying going on anywhere in UKIP, we'd turf them out before you could say Jack Robinson.
I mean, I have to say, Paul, I've had now Nick Clegg take calls about alleged bullying in Lib Dems. This is not uncommon, but I'll come back to you just briefly. Is there one? I know you can't name names. Is there one particular question that you want to put to Nigel? Because we are actually over time.
Yes, why haven't you reacted to these complaints, and why has UKIP head office totally ignored them and refused even to consider them?
Well, Paul, I'll be honest with you. I lead a national political party. I lead a group in the European Parliament. If somebody thought there was a serious allegation that should be brought before me, it would have been brought before me. And we have had serious allegations in the past. Every organisation does. If anything serious had happened that was justifiable and backed up, it would have come to me and I would have acted. And I have no hesitation in saying, I mean, look, we've kicked out scores of people from UKIP who I thought would bring the party into disrepute in a variety of ways. I know that at grassroots level in branches there are all sorts of arguments and enmities, and it happens in political parties, it happens in the Women's Institute, it happens everywhere. Life is like that. But if there was anything really fundamentally wrong, Paul, I would have dealt with it.
And lastly, one from me. Do you support Jeremy Corbyn, or how much support do you have for Mr Corbyn's idea of having Trident submarines where we'll have the submarines but we won't actually load the missiles on?
Oh, help! White flag of surrender. Oh, dear. I thought that the Labour Party were going to do badly in the 2020 general election. I now think they may well do calamitously.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.